This grand final was guaranteed to be one of the more emotional ones in recent years, just given the fact that we have had the grand final losers from 2022 play the grand final losers from 2023. So it'd be double heartbreak for one of these teams. And unfortunately, once again, and this happens a lot for Sydney at the moment, they're falling flat. They're falling flat when it matters in 2014, in 2016, 22, and now 2024, all the years they have lost the grand final. And for Brisbane, well, we can discuss why they were better on the day, but the reality is that second quarter was the game. That was it. And by halftime, you thought to yourself, is it really likely that Sydney can do one of their Mazzolini crazy comebacks? No. And the third quarter, Brisbane ran over the top of them, and that final quarter was just vibes. Pure fucking vibes for Sydney. Now, let's start off with why did Brisbane win? Brisbane won because their game style peaked at the right time. Both these teams have been brilliant all year, but Sydney, you would say their best football was being played from round 0 to round 10. Early on in those weeks, they were phenomenal. And for the Brisbane Lions, you'd say their best football has been played in the finals. And that's the difference between these two teams. If the Lions now came up against the Swans earlier this season, it's a whole different story, it's a different outcome. But Brisbane, they just played better on the day and they peaked at the right time. They had the perfect balance between the short, slow game where they kick short, mark, wait a few seconds, kick short, mark. They dominated uncontested marking, uncontested possessions, and just the territory and the ball was in their hand. Their possession was way better. And what they also did was they had the contrast of that perfect too, which is they knew when to have overlapping runners come for the handball and apply speed to the game. And they caught Sydney off guard. Sydney just let them run off them, take the uncontested mark, and they seemingly left the corridor open. They left the players to run in behind to get the handball. I don't know what their defensive plan was. I don't know what John Longmire, has done. Listen, game styles in the grand final. Like Sydney, I feel like they are so good against teams, not that good. But when it comes to a challenge, do they crumble? That's all I'm saying. Is I don't quite know about that. Now the game, as I said, you'll see the timeline here. It was pretty boring from the start. In terms of players who were good, I mean, we can talk about the Norm Smith now. I thought the Norm Smith should have gone to one of Kai Lohmann, one of Neil Ashcroft or Archie. I think they're the obvious one. Harris Andrews, I think, had a really good game as well. But you've got to give it to, I think, one of the players who performed best when it mattered. And for me, the first two quarters were the mattered quarters. I mean, the last quarter doesn't really matter. But I personally would have edged it to Kai Lohmann. He kicked the 4 goals, I believe, in the first half. That's when it mattered. But I thought Lachie Neale was absolutely phenomenal as well. Will Ashcroft had a great game too. Fair play to him. But the midfielders of Brisbane, even though, like, we'll get to the statistics a little bit later in this video, but I'm not entirely sure they dominated statistically, but the cleanliness, is that the word? Cleanliness around the ball was so apparent and so contrasting to Sydney, who fumbled, second-guessed, and just rushed the kicks, the handballs, and their possession use was not near the quality of the Brisbane Lions. They were prime, and their midfielders for me won the game. Their forwards were dynamic, still a little bit inaccurate at the start, and then their defense was just really steadfast. They were really solid, and they really contributed to the attack. So they played both roles perfectly. I thought it was a fantastic game from the Brisbane Lions, amazingly coached by Chris Fagan, and they could go on and win a few more flags in the next year or two. But it all depends, and we'll get onto this, it all depends on what the likes of Zorko, Danaher, and those types of players choose to do. As for Sydney, look, Sydney, we all know injuries to Isaac Heaney. He was carrying an injury. Logan McDonald was carrying injury as well. No Callum Mills. It was always going to be a little bit of a, I don't know, but not even an uphill task because the Lions didn't even have Big O. And Darcy Ford, I thought, played a fantastic game and he was a great role player. I mean, Luke Parker did kick the 3 goals, but the reality is the normal players, the Gouldens, the Heaneys, the Warners, they weren't firing. And it was maybe the lesser knowns, the row bottoms, I thought had a decent game. I thought maybe even the likes of, I think Fox had a good game maybe. It just wasn't enough the big players didn't stand up. That's the harsh reality of it. And unfortunately, they just failed on the bigger stage once again. Now I'm actually really interested in well, we'll talk about players as well. A few more players that I thought had a really good game. Josh Dunkley, I thought had a decent game defensively with 11 tackles. Grundy's the big one. Now, in terms of hitouts, Grundy's won the hitouts 36-19. But I thought, even though he did have 22 touches, I was a little bit disappointed in Brodie Grundy. The fact he didn't capitalise on the disparity between quality of rucks a little bit more. He was by far the better ruck on the day, but not enough to where it should have been, because, you know, Big O is a better ruck than Grundy for me, and that would have been a great contest. But Darcy Fort is, it's Darcy Fort, and I thought Grundy, he should have pushed forward a bit more. Maybe he was, I don't know. I wasn't entirely impressed with this game. Robbie Fox I thought had a good game, as I've already mentioned. Chad Warner statistically 1 goal and 21 touches, but only the 2 clearances, the 1 tackle. Just not enough in a grand final on the biggest stage. Conversely, Rowbottom with 10 clearances, I thought, he was the one midfielder for Sydney that had a little bit of edge to him. But maybe that's reflective of the game. Rowbottom's a great defensive midfielder. He had those defensive capabilities, and he had to play a more defensive role on the day. He was tagging, I believe, Lachie Neale. Like, loose tag, wasn't a hard tag, and Lachie Neale ran right completely. And we can talk about Lachie Neale really quick. I think the discussion now, given his CV, 2 Brownlows, 2 runners-up to Brownlows. Yes, one of those Brownlows wasn't really deserved, but recent years, outstanding seasons. He's won the flag now as a captain. He's won many awards. Arguably deserved the Norm Smith. For me, probably unfortunate not to get it, but hey, game's a game. It was always going to be a mixed vote. He now belongs, and he always has, but for me, like, he really belongs in the upper echelons. The Dustin Martins, the Chris Judds, those sorts of players now. And where is he on that list? You know, is he above the likes of Cripps, who's won 2 Brownlows, Bontempelli? Is he above 5? Is he above Dangerfield? Is he above the likes of Swan, the likes of Simon Black? You know, a couple questions here. He's undoubtedly one of the best players of the last decade. And these final series, he's proven to us why he is the best in the competition, arguably still. Other players for Sydney we'll talk about the players I was disappointed in. Obviously, Logan McDonald had an awful game, but the injury. Also the same with Heaney. You can't really blame those two. They're injured, but the reality is once you're on the field, that's it. You've crossed the white line. You've got to perform. And I don't think those players performed at all. I was disappointed with Joel Amadi as well. But the forwards like Amadi, Haywood, those kind of forwards, can you really have an influence when the ball's never down there? I'm not entirely sure. Tom Papley, I thought, was a little bit quiet and frustrating. I thought Dane Rampy got dominated a bit too much. I think you can't blame Sydney players. And the reality is, the way the game went, no Sydney player would have good stats. And none of them looked good on the day. But I think it comes down to the coach and the system, just the timing, once again. Why do you peak early in the season, Sydney, if you can't peak in the latter end? And that's why Brisbane deserved it. And that's why I tipped Brisbane. I said they'd only win by, I think, 10 or 12 points. I was not anticipating a 60-point victory. But you could just tell at the start of that second quarter, Brisbane wanted it more. And Sydney looked shot. They looked confused. Even though 2 years ago they've had that experience. They should be better off with that experience. And I think it's just not good enough for them to have performed like they did on the day. Yeah, we're going to move into team stats now. This is actually what I'm quite interested in. Disposals, as we all expect, given the uncontested possessions, Brisbane dominated Sydney 305 to 385, so Brisbane had 80 more kicks, more handballs. I think the most interesting stat out of all of this, and this is sort of reflective of the forward line and the functionality of the forward line, but also pressure on ball and the quality of entries. 49 inside 50s to Sydney, 51 to Brisbane. Effectively even. So how come Sydney only had 15 scoring shots and Brisbane had 30? Brisbane doubled their scoring shots. Well, like I said, it's efficiency inside 50. Brisbane went at 67%, Sydney at 39%. It's the pressure on ball that Brisbane applied meant Sydney could not get a good entry in. It's the defence of Brisbane that was so much more compact than the defence of Sydney, and just the quality of the Brisbane forwards and the movement of the Brisbane forwards meant that Sydney could not defend them. And I thought Sydney defended really poorly that day as a whole team defence, not individual defence, team defence. But I thought that stat was really interesting. But even, like I mentioned before, disposal efficiency, 81% to Brisbane, 70% to the Swans. And Brisbane averaged 72.7 throughout the season. To go to 81% disposal efficiency is pretty unheard of, especially in a grand final. I don't know what the mentality was, but they had it on point. Free kicks, 13 to 16, 3 extra for Brisbane. Hit-outs, Sydney won 42 to 20. Dominate the hit-outs. They should have first hands on the ball to get the clearance, yet they only won the clearance by 1. They won it by 1. In centre clearances, they actually lost by 2. So much for having Grundy for the fucking clearances. He doesn't get them. Contested possessions was even, 115 and 117. But if your contested possessions aren't clean, are they really important? Who knows? And this is the big one. This was the control Brisbane had on the ball. 189 uncontested possessions to the Swans compared to 267 for the Lions. That's effectively 80 extra uncontested possessions to the Lions, who absolutely dominated Brisbane in that vein. Sydney had more turnovers, 62 to 53, so 9 extra turnovers. Once again, showing how clean and succinct the ball movement of Brisbane was. And ultimately, possession, 32% for the Swans, 53% for the Lions throughout the match is just insane. Absolutely insane. Marks, Brisbane nearly doubled Sydney's marks, 88 to 158. Brisbane actually averaged 110 throughout the season. To add 50 to that tally is mental. Absolutely mental. 22 marks inside 50. They just could not defend them, the Swans. 13 contested marks to 7. Perhaps they wanted it more. That stat without Big O is so glaring to have 6 less contested marks, Sydney. And then ultimately, scoring, we all know what happened. Tackles, even Brisbane won that, 45 to 64. They just wanted it more. And what can I say? The stats relatively give you an idea of whose game style came out on top, and it was definitely Brisbane, who had the balance of slow and quick on absolute point. And now the question is, what now? Well, the season's done, but as for Brisbane, they got the flag they wanted. They can relax. Sydney, do they lose Chad Warner? Can they get to this position again next year? Will the wounds be too much? If they do get back next year, the pressure to win that premiership will just be monumental. Absolutely monumental. They've got the quality to get there, Sydney. In fact, for me, assuming Joe Danaher retires, Zorko's a year older, etc., they should have a better list than Brisbane next year. Even if it's better now, it should get even better. So, if you're a Sydney fan, it's not the end of the world. It's not like, what's an example? It's not like, you know your window isn't shut. You know you're not old with veterans. You do have some old players there. Luke Parker might leave, blah, blah, blah. But you know you've got a fair few years left in that premiership window. But for Brisbane, I think you've got probably 1 or 2 more years. I think if Joe Danaher leaves, it's going to be really hard for them to win it next year. But Zorko's probably got a good year or 2 left in him, maybe even 3. He's just aging like fine wine. They're going to get Ashcroft in the draft. 2 Ashcrofts who are both seemingly fantastic players. It's looking good for Brisbane as well. But Neil, he's going to slowly regress over the next 2-3 years as well. So I think if I'm Brisbane, I'm targeting a massive key forward if Joe Danaher leaves, and I'm going again. I think they're still in the premiership window. Fagan's proven he can coach a flag, and geez, I would be scared of Brisbane next season. I think Brisbane Hawthorn's an early shout for a grand final. And yeah, they're all the game reviews. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another one in fucking 6 months or something.